Isn't it amazing that grass grows up and not down and cows eat it? And you don't think that's amazing because you're all sinners. And I'm a sinner. In this video, we're going to revisit John Piper's book, Desiring God, Meditations of a Christian Hedonist. This video is not meant to bash or praise Piper, but just engage with his theological system called Christian Hedonism. My aim is to critique something very specific in his book, and that is the lack of law. So we're going to talk about how I love John Piper. How dare you! Build a case for how he defines feeling and enjoyment in the Christian life, and then how he's replaced law with feeling in his system, and then how that has left the door open for the Young Restless Reformed movement for all kinds of error to seep in. When feeling replaces law, let's go! I love John Piper. I am grateful for John Piper's ministry. I'm so grateful for how he awakened so many to the supremacy of God, his sovereignty in all things. Actually, my favorite piece from Piper is his book that he co-wrote with Jonathan Edwards called God's Passion for His Glory or something like that. Now, the passion and God, we're going to leave that conversation aside for a second. The trouble with that title.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
But what Piper did so effectively was awaken people up for the centrality that God has for himself. That God, in all that he does, seeks to glorify his own name. And that was a truth that had fallen by the wayside. And we needed someone like Piper to show us God loves God. And then his Christian ethics are built upon that fact, that God's passion is for his glory, his own glory. And so therefore the Christian life must all be about the glory of God. Now most of this video is focused on one specific criticism and how feeling has replaced law. But I just want to start by saying, for what it's worth, I've read Desiring God multiple times, Pleasures of God multiple times, listened to the Desiring God sermon series multiple times, Pleasures of God sermon series multiple times. Me and my wife, when we were dating, read his book on fasting called Hunger for God together. Read Momentary Marriage. I don't think there's anything that I haven't read from Piper. All the good, the bad, and the restless, I absorbed from Piper. It deeply ingested it, and it deeply impacted my life and made me very, very serious about the Christian life and the glory of God. Another thing that Piper did was introduce us to Jonathan Edwards, and with him, the entire Reformed tradition. And we can quibble over how John Piper is Reformed or not. I personally don't feel comfortable calling Piper Reformed. Because of what he does to Westminster Shorter Catechism Question 1. We'll get to that in a second. Just saying that these criticisms come from a place of love, having spent a lot of time with Piper and appreciate so much of his ministry, and yet I can still walk away and say, I think that this part of his system was unclear. So his influence starts at this tent revival-like sermon, if we want to try to find a moment where the Young Restless Reformation started, and that was at that moment. For me, the Young Restless Reformation started for the Shocking Youth Message by Paul Washer.
I don't know why you're clapping. I'm talking about you.
John Piper gets up there, it's rainy, and this wild-haired man stands up in front of a bunch of teenagers and starts to talk about tragedy.
Ruby Eliason and
Laura Edwards.
Over a cliff they go, and they're dead instantly. And I asked my people, is this a tragedy? I'll read you what a tragedy is. Bob and Penny took early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years ago when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida. Play softball and collect shells. That's a
Tragedy. Look, Lord, here's my
shell collection.
And look at my golf swing, God.
And look at my boat.
Another thing I loved about Piper, as seen in how he expressed himself, was his sincerity. When Piper gets up to preach, you know that this is the man. And so many preachers, when they get up, are putting on an act, and they're not being themselves. In line with his book, Brothers, We're Not Professionals, it doesn't feel like he's doing professional speak to me. To this day, my favorite sermon by Piper, I listen to it about once a year, is The Pleasures of God in Creation. My favorite theological magazine is by Ranger Rick. His tone would match the tone of the text. In Romans 8, a sermon about killing sin. And my mama, she wrote in one of my Bibles, something very similar to what John Owen said. And I still got that Bible on my shelf. Every now and then I pull it off the shelf and smell it. Just remind me of grace. I mean, he's talking like a sheriff in a western town, because he's talking about killing sin. And she wrote in that book, Johnny, this book will keep you from sin, or sin will keep you from this book. Can you tell that I love Piper? Now let's move on to the criticisms.
How dare you!
Now let's briefly just define Stoicism and hedonism. Since his system is called Christian Hedonism, what is hedonism, and what is hedonism compared to Stoicism? Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium in 300 BC, became the most popular worldview in Rome. It places virtue, self-control, and reason at the center of its system as the primary means by which human beings can achieve peace despite external circumstances. The natural order is something we should not try to resist. We must therefore accept calmly what happens to us, hence the term Stoic. As opposed to Stoicism, hedonism places external circumstances at the center of its system. While Stoicism focused on avoiding pleasure for the sake of virtue, hedonism made pleasure the center of gravity for its entire worldview. Avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure is life's highest good. And Christianity includes threads from these systems, because Christianity is not defined by any one philosophical system on earth. It's a faith that comes to us from heaven. And so you're going to see philosophical threads from earthly philosophical systems wrapped up in Christianity. So when you scan the New Testament, you're going to find times where the apostles are commanding us to set aside our passions for the sake of virtue, but you're also going to find elements of enjoyment and feeling and passion as essential in the Christian life as well. Commands to love and to rejoice, to earnestly love. So Piper really hinges his entire system on this idea that the pursuit of pleasure is not optional, it is essential. Now, my criticisms of Piper, I feel like I'm going to be repeating a lot of other people, and so hopefully I'm adding something helpful to the conversation, not just repeating what other people have said. But as has been noted, Piper was inspired by C.S. Lewis first and foremost. His own retelling of the story is that he's reading from Lewis from his sermon, The Weight of Glory, where Lewis says that our desires are in fact not too strong, they're actually too weak. And we need more desire and pleasure in God. And so in line with that, Piper says, quote, I know of no other way to triumph I know of no other way to triumph over sin long term than to gain a distaste for it because of a superior satisfaction in God.
Not too shabby.
Okay, so on the face of it, you can look at that and say, okay, that checks out. But then the deeper you get into his system, the more you go back to that quote and you're like, that line, there's no other way, starts to get more and more questionable. This is sort of an avalanching argument. On the face of it, that doesn't look too bad, but the deeper you go into it, it starts to become more troubling. So after that quote, you can draw your attention to the fact that he has changed Westminster Shorter Catechism's question 1, which says the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And Piper said, nah, chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying him forever. So he changes and to by. And? Like ham and eggs? Sometimes you glorify God, and sometimes you enjoy him. Sometimes he gets the glory. Sometimes you get joy. But then he also says this, which I think is probably one of the most telling things about how Piper defines satisfaction. You're commanded not to covet. And it is obvious that every command to not have a certain feeling is also a commandment to feel a certain way. The opposite of covetousness is contentment with what we have. And this is exactly what we are commanded to experience in Hebrews 13:5. Be content with what you have. So Piper has just redefined obedience as feeling. Okay, still not that bad, but as the avalanche continues, now it's not just satisfaction, but it's specifically the feeling aspect of satisfaction.
I'm in love, and I don't care who knows it.
We wouldn't deny that there is a sense, experience, a perception of feeling, that there is emotions that come along in the experience of the Christian life. But what Piper is doing is taking that and making it the chief thing. He's making it the primary aim and the primary goal in the Christian life is that feeling. And again, Christianity comes to us with this command to be content and to not covet. But those are commands from God, and they may map onto human experiences and include human feelings, but are those things, when we read them in the text of Scripture, are they intended to exclusively be defined as commands of feeling? He defines contentment as a feeling. Westminster Shorter Catechism 1, he is changed and to buy. So we cannot glorify God unless we are enjoying him. Then based on how he defines that enjoyment, he defines the commandment, the law, as feeling. Then here's the real kicker. This is the major piece of the avalanching argument, I believe, is the actual system as it's spelled out as God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And so how he's defined feeling up to this point, how he's defined these desires and this pleasure and this satisfaction, is a maximal emotional experience. It's like a level of degrees, and in as much as I am experiencing joy, then I'm obedient. But when that joy starts to go down, that's the levels of sin there.
He's an angry elf.
If I'm going to be obedient, I need to make sure my joy, my sense or feeling of the emotion of joy needs to be as much as possible, or I'm sinning. On top of that, I believe that how Piper's defining feeling is not just feeling as it is, but actually our perception of the feeling, which is troubling because we as finite and changeable beings, like our perception changes. So our feelings change all the time, and then our perception of the feelings change all the time, and our perception of the feelings could be wrong. Maybe we're super depressed, but we actually are full of joy. And again, that shows the transcendent nature of Christianity, that it's not defined by these feelings. Our obedience or our faithfulness is not defined by these things. I think that comes out in the story that he tells about going to get Noelle flowers. That if he were to go out and get her flowers and was doing it as a stoic, so he was setting aside his lack of delight in wanting to get his wife flowers aside and getting flowers because he must do that as a husband. That's not real faithfulness to his wife. It would be a real act of love if he was delighting to get her flowers and bring her flowers. But it's just interesting to me to consider in how Piper is psychologizing the experience of buying flowers for his wife, is that he actually has to, and he's inviting you to do the same, as though you were buying flowers. You have to put yourself in the experience of buying flowers for your wife and interpret your interpretation of your feelings in the moment of buying flowers for your wife.
Wow.
And considering whether or not you have a ton of feelings or delight or pleasure in that experience as to whether or not you're truly being loving. And so because of this, I step back and say, it seems like Piper is defining not just satisfaction by feeling, but actually our perception of the feeling, which reminds me of the hymn, I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name.
Wow.
The gospel ought to be our motivation. So that which is a result of motivation in the gospel needs to actually replace the motivation of the gospel. So the fruit is replacing the root in our motivation in Piper's system. One thing that I think Piper was trying to do, but he put too much emphasis on the maximalization of it, is guiding Christians back to sincerity. We do need to be sincere. And with him on that point, I agree. We need to be sincere and real, not hypocritical Christians.
I'm done. You pretend to be Joy.
I couldn't agree with him more on this. But I think Piper goes further than the importance of sincerity and places too much emphasis on a perception of maximal sensation of feeling toward God. The Bible doesn't place such an emphasis on a high degree of feeling. Its emphasis is on the sincere existence of faith as a hand that receives Christ and his gifts. I think of the woman with the blood discharge of 12 years in the Gospels. She comes to Christ with an open hand and grabs just the fringe of his garment. And that was enough for her to receive the power of Christ for healing. The emphasis is on sincerity, not a maximal degree of feeling. And as the Young Restless Reformed movement's ethicist, I feel comfortable calling him, we look to Piper as this guy who didn't write about just anything, but he was always writing about the Christian life, money and marriage. And he's given us no clear law, really, is my point. That Piper, as a representative of the Young Restless Reform movement, doesn't give this restless crowd any law to guide and guard their restless hearts. And what this does for the Young Restless Reform movement is it opens the door for all kinds of errors to seep in. I'm going to be spending more energy on my channel talking about the fall of the Young Restless Reform movement, but I believe that in part you could say that Piper wasn't the cause of the entrance of wokeness into the Young Restless Reform movement, but his lack of law as our ethicist in the movement did not protect us when those things came along, and he had ideologies which encouraged, ironically, covetousness. And I feel comfortable saying that the Young Restless Reform movement drove the gospel-centered movement. And so, and if not, you could say that the Young Restless Reform movement was the gospel-centered movement. There's so much talk about the gospel, and of course, we're going to take issue with how Piper defined justification by faith, or did a poor job in defining justification by faith, especially with his doctrine of final justification, which we can get into maybe in a future video. But the fact of the matter remains that there was such an awakening and such a revival about the gospel.
Those were the good old days.
And that was wrapped up in Calvinism, but the sovereignty of God in salvation woke a lot of people up to their inability to save themselves and even live. They needed God, and so it was a big God, a big God, and a big gospel. And on this note, I think it's important to point out what Charles Bridges says in his book, The Christian Ministry. There ain't a better book on the Christian ministry. Go buy that. We cannot indeed have too much of the gospel, but we may have too little of the law. And a defect in evangelical preaching law is as clear cause of inefficient ministration as illegal preaching of the gospel. We cannot have too much of the gospel, but we can have too little of the law. And my critique of the Young Restless Reform movement is that they didn't give us enough law. And I think that in part starts at desiring God, that Piper doesn't end up giving us enough law. He really just redefines law and replaces law with feeling. And that created more restlessness in an already restless generation. In fact, the movement is called the Young Restless Reformed movement. I want to spend more time exploring the different ways in which the Young Restless Reformed movement has splintered off, because in part people want clear standards of law to guide their restless hearts, especially as they get older, create businesses, have jobs, and have more children. They want to know, how then should I live? If you like John Piper and or consider yourself a Christian hedonist, Godspeed. I say the same about him as I say about Jonathan Edwards. I personally don't generally recommend him, and if I did, it would come with caveats. Because I'm a Reformed Baptist with convictions, we tend to distinguish a lot and practice a lot of precise theological distinctions, and I realize that can be off-putting for some people sometimes. Maybe even some other Reformed types don't like it, but I'm not trying to be anyone other than myself, and I'm trying to be biblical, and that comes with attempting to be precise, so take my interpretation of Piper for what it's worth. Speaking of Edwards, Piper will certainly go down in history as one of the greatest preachers of his generation, and I find comfort in that. At a time when easy times have created weak men and evangelicalism, men like Piper came along and cast a grand vision for the glory of God. Some in the Reformed world may even return to Piper to be reminded of the importance of desire in the Christian life, and that's a wonderful thing, especially if they already have a background in Reformed theology and can read him charitably, without being captured by less than precise ways of speaking sometimes. The fact is, the testimonies I have heard over time pile up of how listening to Piper didn't lead them to peace that we have in Jesus, but in fact made them even more restless. While those testimonies are not the final word, Reformed theology has good explanations for why that may be the experience of so many. There is a sense in which I hate making this video because most of the time I love to say, "Don't bully my Piper," but as a Reformed Baptist, I cannot deny the effects of defining obedience in almost exclusively terms of feeling. But I love John Piper. We ought to learn from him the importance of sincerity. And if we don't preach a big God, are we preaching God at all? In this crazy internet age, we all feel a little restless, and we should pursue an ordinary life of peace with God and men. And what's going to do it? Staying Baptist, my friends. And thank you from Crooked Lake, Houston, Adam, and thanks, Paul, for my coffee. And if you want to join, then check out patreon.com/BobTheBaptist. We are trying different things as a way to say thank you for your support. But most importantly, we are trying to have fun while build our community together. So go over to patreon.com/BobTheBaptist and see if you're interested in becoming a member. Buy me a coffee or become a free member. That's patreon.com/BobTheBaptist. Link in the description below.